my name's Antonia Forster. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a senior XR technical specialist and an advocate at Unity. So Unity, for anyone who's not familiar, is an engine for creating any kind of virtual experience, very popular for games, but you can really use it for anything that you can imagine, any kind of digital, interactive, real-time 3D content. So I specialize in mixed reality, so creating virtual reality and augmented reality experiences using Unity. So I specialize in taking complex technical information and breaking it down into simple language. I did that in the field of science and zoology for some time. I then worked in a planetarium making 3D 360-degree virtual content. And from there, I transitioned into virtual reality and became a virtual reality specialist. I don't have a degree in computer science. I learned to code using basically YouTube and Unity Learn. If you have a disability that's physical or mobility related, it might be difficult to commute, for example. If you have a neurodivergence, there might be difficulties in working. For example, I actually have ADHD, I'm neurodivergent myself. I find it very difficult to work in an open plan office because I'm very easily distracted. And I also tend to oscillate between really lack of focus and like hyper focus and not being able to come out. So that's very challenging when there's kind of constant interaction. But actually working remotely is really much more accessible for me personally because I can, if I'm not focused, I can do lots of kind of small tasks. If I'm hyper focused, that's when I can code and I can kind of do it for 12 hours and just, work really, really deeply and kind of work around myself. If you yourself don't have a team with that group of people represented, then at least have a consultant or a focus group or representative within the community that you liaise with very regularly from the very beginning of your design process. I think it's very dangerous to build something and then as an afterthought to add inclusion in. And that often doesn't work because you'll find that key features, so things like your locomotion system or even the hardware itself or the packaging on your hardware. If you're thinking about accessibility, it's so important to think from the very beginning to the very end of the pipeline. What do you mean by accessibility? Which specific people are you trying to access? What problems will they have? And how can you make sure you're not putting up additional barriers? I have seen like plugins that people have created that work with Unity. So even if they're not created by Unity, there's so many people out there using the Unity editor, that there's all sorts of different plugins and accessibility packages. Fonts are a really easy one. For example, if you're in a VR chat world and there's lots of bloom, like a post-processing light effect, there's actually an object someone created, a third-party person, not working at Unity, which is a pair of sunglasses that your character can put on, and it reduces all light intensity and it also reduces sound intensity, which means that for someone potentially who's autistic or someone who has, I sometimes get sort of sensitivity issues, you can place these on and it will sort of dampen everything. And another example is, if you're in VR chat and you're deaf or partially deaf and someone talks to you from behind you, you may not realize. VR chat actually has a large number of deaf users. There's in fact whole worlds where people use hand tracking to learn sign language, either BSL or ASL. But if you're a deaf user and someone talks behind you, you may not realize. So I've seen another tool where if people tap you on the shoulder virtually, an avatar taps your avatar, something will come up in front of you to say, hey, someone's behind you. And then you can turn around and interact with them. I'm a member of the LGBT community. The strongest predictor of homophobia is a lack of exposure to queer people and queer stories. So I approached a number of people and asked them, if you had your story represented in a museum using one object from your life, what would you choose and why? And I allowed people to choose any object from their life that they wanted. I scanned the object using a technique called photogrammetry, where you take lots of images and stitch them into a 3D object. I asked them to explain what the object's significance was. So we have 2 to 3 minutes of audio in their own voice. And then I created a virtual museum to put those objects in. I worked with another developer very closely, Thomas Terkelsen, who's based in Denmark. He's also a member of the LGBT community. And together we built this virtual space to center queer stories. Throughout history, some people's experiences are erased or lost. We wanted to build a space to preserve and celebrate those stories. And now we're open for visitors.
Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin was my first clumsy attempt at age 14 to come out to my family. I would leave the book around the house and hope that someone would spot it and start a conversation about me being gay.
These are my wedding shoes. We fell in love in the early 80s. We felt like any other couple, just getting on with our lives. But we kept being reminded that we were not allowed the luxury of just ordinary.
I identify as a black, queer, polyamorous person.
I grew up in a Christian family in Ghana.
As a non-binary person,
I'm a gender non-conforming woman.
I'm a transgender man, and I turn 40 years old this year.
This over life-size Carrara marble statue is the first and only marriage equality monument in the world. I sculpted this when gay marriage was illegal anywhere and everywhere in the United States. What I couldn't have in life, I would have forever in death.
Over time, the church pulpit became a bipolar symbol of
Use a
love and
knife
hate.
as a symbol
Other
of
people
battle
will
I
turn
have
out
seen
right,
this attraction,
to stand by my
silence.
fellow
now believe
soldiers,
that
but as long as
at
we
your
carry
side
torches for
with
ourselves and for
my
each other,
love.
we'll never be alone in the dark.